Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome Yuval Noah Harari and Judd Apatow, both back to our series. Yuval joins us from Tel Aviv and Judd in Santa Monica, California. We invite you to visit our YouTube channel for over 300 conversations much like this. You can also watch the video from our event with Yuval from his last book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Yuval's new book is Sapiens, A Graphic History, The Birth of Humankind, Volume 1. Yuval is a historian, philosopher, and the best-selling author of Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and as I mentioned earlier, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Judd is one of the most sought-after comedic minds in the industry, has directed, produced, and written many of the biggest comedy, films, and hit TV shows of the last 2 decades. I am Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of the series. Thanks to those of you who sent in questions that I will ask towards the end of the event. I will let you take it from here, Judd.
All right. Well, it's great to be here speaking with you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
I'll show the book right off the bat, which I couldn't have enjoyed more. Sometimes you read a book and you think, I should read more books like this. And you realize that I've mainly been reading self-help books my entire life. I'm usually just trying to stay sane, and most of my reading involves that. But I really loved it, and it, just to start from the self-help angle for a moment, my therapist always says that, what's happening most of the time with me emotionally is that when, early man was evolving, so much of the brain evolved from a sense of, I need to know where the bear is that's going to try to kill me. And as a result, I am wired to remember bad stuff, because if I don't remember where the cave is that has the bear, I'm gonna die. And that in a modern world, we are wired to be in the woods or to be hunting. And so much of the problems that we have as people, that we have emotionally, is because all of our wiring is built for another way of life. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, completely. This is one of the most basic insights of history and of evolution, that we still have Stone Age bodies and Stone Age brains and minds, but we live in a post-industrial society in the 21st century, and so many of our problems result from this mismatch. I mean, one of the most common examples is with food. That if you ask yourself, how come we like so much to eat sugar and fat and all the things that are bad for us? And I mean, it seems unreasonable. Why would our body crave things that are not good for it? It's simply because in the Stone Age, they were good for you. I mean, if you go in the African savannah and you find a tree full of ripened figs, the correct thing to do in order to survive is to eat as many of them as quickly as possible. If you eat just 2 or 3 figs and you say, no, I'm watching my weight, and I'll come back tomorrow, you come back tomorrow, it's empty, because the baboons next door ate everything. Yeah. And this is still the kind of program that our body runs. And when you open the door of the fridge and you see the chocolate cake, the body still reacts as if you are in the African savannah and just found a tree full of figs. And yeah, it's go explain to the body that this is the 21st century.
Well, explain it to my wife, who's mad at me for eating the entire cake. She doesn't get it. This is all helpful for the fight that we have, because I've always had that urge, and I never understood it, which was, no matter how much someone puts on the plate, I will finish it. And I have a feeling like you have to finish it. I don't know why, but I actually feel bad if I don't finish it. But also, I think it applies so much to our general sense of anxiety, that we all are built to be looking for a predator, and life doesn't really work that way. And it feels like we do live in a world where everybody is overreacting all the time.
To some extent, yes, even though it should be said that we are also living in the most peaceful era in human history. It may not look like it from the news. And, you know, I live in Israel, I live in the Middle East, so I know perfectly well there are still conflicts around. But still, it's the most peaceful society that humans have ever managed to create, with all the anxieties, with all the worries. You think about LA, I mean, how many people live in LA? Like a couple of millions, right? Like 5, 6, 7 million, something. To think that you can cram millions of people into such a small place and they all live together, and most of the time they don't kill each other, that's a remarkable achievement. Again, especially as you don't know most of these people. In the Stone Age, the basic mechanism was that you trust the people you know intimately, your band members. You go hunt together and forage together, and you know them for years, so you trust them. Anybody you don't know personally is a stranger, a potential threat. Very difficult to trust. You go on a busy street, maybe you meet more people in 1 hour than our ancestors met in their entire lifetime. And they are all strangers, and you just trust that they won't pull a knife and kill you on the spot. And that's an amazing achievement. So we are not completely enslaved by our Stone Age legacy.
Yeah, and when you see what happened, this week in the United States, with the elections and what's happened the last few years, people talk a lot about tribalism and how people have this instinct to group together in ideologies. How do you look at what happened in the last few years, through a historical lens?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, first of all, people confuse the kind of, you hear a lot of people say that nationalism or tribalism is in our genes, or it's part of our genetic and biological makeup, because humans are social animals. And this is a complete mistake. Humans are social animals, that's true, but we are programmed to feel part of a very small group of people who we know intimately. This is the key. For millions of years, humans and our ape ancestors, we lived in very small communities where everybody knows everybody else. The amazing thing about a nation like the United States today, or like Israel, or like China, or any other nation, is that this is not a small, intimate community. If I look at Israel, it's a small country. We just have something like 8 million citizens. But still, I don't know 99.9% of these people. And still, I can feel a bond with them. And that's completely different from Stone Age bands. The big project of modern nationalism, which is a completely new project, is to make millions of strangers trust one another, and not just trust one another, but actually care about one another. And nationalism is often, blamed from wars and so forth, but it's also one of the best things that humans ever managed to come up with. Because it does, the feeling of patriotism and national solidarity does enable millions of strangers to cooperate effectively, to, you pay taxes, so that somebody you never met and you will never meet in your life on the other side of the country will have good health care and education. That's nationalism, and that's wonderful. One of the worrying things when I look at the US today is that this is collapsing. With all the talk about the rise of nationalism, you look around the world today, you actually see the collapse of nationalism, of these kinds of national bonds. Many leaders who portray themselves as nationalists, they are actually on purpose dividing their society. They have this confusion. They think that nationalism is about hating foreigners. And because I hate foreigners so much, I'm a good nationalist. But nationalism is not about hating foreigners. It's about loving your compatriots. And we don't have enough of that. If you have a president who, at least according to reports, paid $750 in taxes a year, And he's a president, and he's a billionaire. He pays $750 in taxes. That's anti-nationalism. I mean, the most basic thing to pay your taxes honestly so that somebody on the other side of the country will get a good healthcare and education, that's how you show your nationalism, not by inciting hatred against foreigners or by waving a flag or something.
Yeah, when you see, 70 million people, watch what's happened in the United States over the last almost 4 years, decide that they're all for it and let's do more. Let's do more of this. And for me, it shows a certain amount of lack of compassion for other people or understanding of, the struggles that other people have. How do you interpret that support at this moment with somebody who certainly their ability to take care of them is questionable? What do you think unites them? And also just historically, what is the precedent for supporting someone in the midst of a pandemic where, most people would agree for whatever reasons it's not being managed in a good way?
Well, I'm not an expert on US politics or society. And as a historian, I know it's dangerous when you move from describing events to describing the motivation of people, especially when it's people from a different culture, from a different background. That's very, very shaky territory. You tend to imagine all kinds of motivations which maybe are not there. And the best thing is just to ask. I didn't vote in the elections, I'm not American, but to ask Trump supporters, why did you vote for him after these 4 years, and listen to what they say. That's a better course of action than to ask an Israeli historian why all these people. I mean, I have my theories, but
yes, I know. If
you ask me about, if you ask me about the Roman Empire, then the Romans are dead. Yeah. So if you ask why did you support Julius Caesar, we can't ask them. So let's ask the historians. Yeah. Here you're talking about people who are alive and maybe are your neighbors. So the best is to just, again, I can say many things about it, but we have to be careful about imputing, is that a word? Maybe I just invented it, about assuming that the motivation is X, and sometimes you're just projecting something onto these people.
I thought what was so interesting, just as a storyteller, is when you write in the book about stories and the necessity for stories, and part of that is how religion began when people were suddenly in groups not of 150 people but thousands of people or millions of people, and that these stories in religion kept order, that suddenly the rules for society and how we treated each other and what would happen if we didn't, was all in these religious stories, and that's what kept everything from falling apart. And it does feel like in this moment that is a bit of what we're dealing with, which is half the country believes in one story and half the country believes in another story.
No, basically, it's almost like that in politics. Humans are storytelling animals. Our identities are based on the stories we believe, and you can almost never inspire people to political action by just telling them scientific facts. If you go around telling people E equals mc squared, the most basic equation in physics, who is going to vote for you? Okay, so E equals mc squared, so what? To really inspire people, you need some story, some mythology, which might be closer or less close to the truth. Very often in history, you see completely fictitious stories which have nothing to do with the truth, and they are still very successful politically in uniting and inspiring people. And that's just a basic fact of history, that this is how humans work. We need to come to terms with it. You know, in any country, not just the US, also in Israel, also in Poland, in Brazil, if you go and tell people the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as your political platform, almost nobody would vote for you. Or at least you would never get to be president or prime minister. Again, we do need the truth for some things, but let's take an example, building an atom bomb. You know, you want to build an atom bomb. Now, you need two things to do it. First of all, you do need a truthful scientific theory. If you try to build an atom bomb with a false scientific theory, it won't work. It will fail. So you need good physics. But that's not enough, because to build the bomb, you need millions of people to cooperate. You need people to mine uranium, and you need mathematicians to calculate all kinds of equations, and you need engineers to put it all together, and you need farmers to grow wheat to feed all the rest of them, and millions of people to cooperate. And for that, you need a story, and the story can be a complete myth. It can be a religious myth, it can be a nationalist myth, it can be an economic myth. But that's what actually succeeds in uniting millions of people towards a common goal.
Yeah, and we see this in our country when, you know, Trump comes down the stairs and says, you know, the Mexicans are sending their rapists. He's beginning a story, a type of propaganda to unite people in a fear that only he can solve it. But the other story he tells is, I don't pay my taxes because I'm smart. And he's training people to distrust the government and then to distrust the media, so that you know, all these stories end with, you only can trust me to solve all of your problems. I wonder, you know, when you put together a book like this, so this is the graphic version of your book, you know, talk a little bit about your interest in just getting people excited about history and young people excited about history. I mean, when I read it, I thought, well, I'm ashamed of how little I know. I have my lack of knowledge shame, which I've always had generally. But I also was excited about the fact that your work is so popular. And I know that, you know, part of the result of this type of work is people understanding how we work as a global community, what our motivations are, how we got here, and hopefully it leads to people making better decisions about lifting each other up, because the ultimate result of all of this knowledge that you put out there is, if we're not in it together, if we don't support each other, we can't actually solve the gigantic challenges and problems that are in front of us. Can you just speak to your motivations for why you're a historian and how you feel about writing these books?
Well, I think this book in particular, graphic novel, I would say is a populist project. You know, populism is now in the news all the time. It doesn't have to be right-wing authoritarian leaders. It can also be scientists. I mean, the idea is to bring science to the people. Don't confine it to the university. Don't confine it. You don't need a PhD or even a bachelor degree in history or in economics or in biology to understand this stuff. This is kind of the inheritance of all humans. They should all have access to this kind of knowledge. And for that, scientists need to make an effort. When we talk among ourselves, when I speak with other professors for history or economics or biology or whatever, so you know, you talk a lot in terms of numbers and statistics and models and things like that. But people think, as I said, in stories. And to reach the wider audience, you need to translate the latest findings of science into an accessible story that anybody can read and understand and even enjoy. You don't need to go to college or to university for that. And that, you know, it's most scientists don't engage with this kind of project. And it's okay. I mean, if everybody would do it, then who would be in the laboratories doing the research?
Yeah.
So it's part of my job to do this kind of translation. In my previous books, I wrote, popular science, but it was still kind of very academic. 500 pages, words, footnotes, here and there an image, but it's for many people it's inaccessible. In the graphic novel, I teamed up with two very gifted artists, Danielle and David, and together we decided to kind of break all the academic conventions. And it's not just the old text with illustrations. It's got a completely fresh approach. Let's experiment with different ways of telling science and telling history. And it was really a fun project. One chapter is like a detective movie. Yeah. Like we have a chapter about the disappearance of the large animals of the planet. More than 10,000 years ago, about half of the big animals of the world disappeared. Until 10,000 years ago, in America, in what is today the USA, you had mammoths and mastodons and horses and camels and lions and whatever. And they all disappeared quite suddenly. What happened? So we tell this as a detective story. We created this fictional character, Detective Lopez, and she goes not only around America, but around the whole world, investigating the disappearance of the large animals. She's on the trails of the worst serial killers in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Who did it? And it's still science. It's still loyal to the basic ideals of the facts and the latest evidence, but it's told in a completely different way.
Yeah, no, it's very, I thought that the book was very entertaining and that every chapter has a different style and a different approach to getting information across in a way that normally is much drier, and it's funny. I think that the book is really hilarious at times in the way it's using these devices to make this information more interesting to young people. I think it really works, and it does seem like it must have been very fun to come up with these using a reality show format.
I don't know. I don't know what is your experience, but I always thought it was kind of bad manners to laugh from your own jokes.
Yeah, I know you have to.
Yeah, but when working on this book, I found myself like in front of the computers just laughing from my own jokes, which, it's not something to be proud of, but it happened.
Well, I think that part of it is, trying to convince the audience why they should care. And I felt that throughout the book, which is, you're using humor and different storytelling devices to remind people, this is how we got here. This is why we behave this way, and that this is, the most vital information. I think just like a lot of people in the United States, young people don't understand civics. They don't even understand how the country works. And when we have all of these problems, suddenly they realize, oh, I don't even understand the Electoral College. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why they created it, and there seems to be such a
but I mean, the electoral college is really complicated. I mean, you need to start with even simpler things. Like what are corporations?
Yeah.
Like the entire economy, the entire world, to a large extent, is being managed by corporations, whether it's Facebook and Google or Toyota and Mitsubishi and General Motors. And most people don't even know what is a corporation.
Yeah.
We often work for them. They shape our lives. And yet, and this is, I mentioned because there is a chapter on this in the book. And when you really get into it, it's an extremely complicated thing to understand what a corporation actually is. Because again, it's just a story. It's just, in our minds, in our imagination. Google doesn't exist anywhere in the physical or biological world. It's not like a mountain or an animal, an elephant or a whale that is just, no. It's a story created by the greatest storytellers in the world, lawyers. Just as ancient humans had their shamans and priests who told stories, and the stories that the shaman told created demons and ghosts and spirits and fairies. It created them in the mind of the people. It's exactly the same thing with lawyers. Google is a fictional story. It's what lawyers call a legal fiction.
Yeah.
They tell a story, and just as the shamans created ghosts, the lawyers today create these corporations, and they're extremely powerful. And to understand that is such an important thing in order to understand how the world functions.
Yeah, and then with something like Facebook, they try to create an identity to tell that story. We're the people that help you chat with your friends, and we're just about us all connecting and doing good for the world. And then slowly people understand, wait a second, all their algorithms take advantage of all the ways we hate each other, and they make more money when we're online, and we're online longer when it's something that aggravates us or makes us angry. And suddenly this thing that's meant to make us all friends, we realize, it's making people kill each other on the other side of the world. It's affecting elections, and then they're out front going, no, we're still the people who are trying to make us all chat. And look, we have Instagram. We're like the Instagram. Share your photos with your friends. We're the nice people. And you see the collapse of this, false identity that they create to seem harmless when in fact they're selling your information to people. I was watching a documentary, and they said, when you don't pay for something, you're the product. You're being sold. And it feels like that seems to be what's happening with social media right now, which is the story of it is people are onto it. They don't know what to do about it. Like, oh, YouTube's so friendly, but like, oh no, it sends me to the darkest stuff. They kind of make more money from the darkest stuff, or at least
the interest is to keep you on the platform as long as possible. And unfortunately, the best or easiest way to keep people on the platform is to press the anger button or the hatred button or the fear button. If you see a headline that makes you really angry, then you click on it to see what did he do this time? Yeah. But if you see a headline which is just, some boring, calm stuff every day, then you won't click on it. So it's not even, there is no intention to deliberately increase tensions and extremism and so forth. It's just a byproduct of trying to keep more people, more time on the platform. And I think one of the other key things is that people have this confusion, especially in places like Silicon Valley, that the more information flows, the more people are connected and know the truth. But information and truth are completely different things. Just by making more information flow, you don't necessarily increase truth. A lot of the information throughout history that have flowed between people has nothing to do with the truth. And you see it not just with the current revolution in information technology, but also in previous revolutions. For instance, when print came to Europe from East Asia in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, 15th century, Gutenberg creates the first printing press in Europe. So people have this fantasy that printing and the lower cost of books spread education and spread science. And you often hear that the print revolution brought about the scientific revolution. Actually, when you look at what is published in Europe at that time, the biggest bestsellers, they are not Copernicus and Galileo Galilei and Newton. The biggest bestsellers behind the Bible and the religious books are things like do-it-yourself witch hunts, One of the first big bestsellers of Europe after print was a book called Malleus Maleficarum. In English, that means the hammer of the witches, which is a do-it-yourself guide to identifying and killing witches. Something everybody needs to have at home, of course. And it's, it sells like hot cakes. And people take this and read and starting witch hunts. And the big period of witch hunts is not the Middle Ages. People associate witch hunts with the Middle Ages. No, the really big period for witch hunts is the early modern period, fueled to a large extent by this print revolution. So just by inventing a new means to communicate and to spread information, in itself, this doesn't guarantee truth or science or harmony or anything like that.
And is that also related to our primal instinct to always be looking for threats and to be looking for what might harm us? And so we're just in that stance generally. And so maybe in the next generation, it's Mein Kampf or it's Hitler on the radio or, rallies that people are just looking for someone to say, who's going to hurt us and what can we do about it before it happens?
As I said, if you want to grab people's attention, then pressing the fear button or the hatred button is the easiest way to do it, because it kind of short circuits your entire brain. Like, we are built evolutionarily in such a way that if there is a threat to our life, it immediately overrides everything else.
Yeah.
This is a basic survival mechanism. So if you're scanning your Facebook feed or your local bookstore in the 16th century, and you see a headline or a title which basically tells you your life is in danger, then your attention goes there, and it overrules, it overrides everything else. And we need to make the effort both to regulate it on a collective level, and also to strengthen ourselves, our own mind, to resist these tendencies.
Yeah, I do think that people are just beginning to understand how their minds work and how they work with modern technology. I have two daughters, and we have to talk about this all the time. How are the gadgets making you feel? Why are you on it right now? Do you even want to be on it? What is your relationship with the addiction to it? Because I remember years ago, in the early ages.
I'll say.
Yes, please.
I'll say just one more thing about what to do about it. We also have to keep kind of a balanced mind. Yes, there are these dark forces, but there are also counter forces, our allies in the human psyche, in the human mind. And comedy and humor are one of the best antidotes. And this goes back also to the African savannah. When somebody in a hunter-gatherer band became a bully or began kind of oppressing other people, one of the best way to take this person down a notch was humor, to ridicule, to satirize. And you see it like even today, anthropologists say that in a hunter-gatherer society, when somebody goes and hunts, a big deer and comes back, everybody is, of course, happy that this person brought the big deer, but they are concerned that this will make this person arrogant and he will kind of become their little dictator. Yeah. So they immediately ridicule and belittle him. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important function. It's not in modern TV that you have these satire shows and comedies. It goes all the way back to the beginning of human history, that comedians and satirists and humor have when you're confronted by some big dictator, there is nothing like humor to bring this person down, which is one of the reasons why one of the first things they do, the dictators, is to have censorship of comedy and of humor and of these things.
And so the evolutionary beginning of comedy was, a force to maintain order in some way. And so instead of killing the arrogant guy, they would mock the arrogant guy. Like there must have been a moment where like, what do I either have to beat this guy up or I can say this to him, and just in evolution, it just seems to work better to not murder every guy who is being a pain in the ass.
Exactly. I mean, it's much better for everybody if you can deal with it with a joke and not with a knife or with an axe to the head. And it's a very important. And the thing about it, it draws attention. It's contagious. The laughter.
Yeah.
And it works immediately to kind of deflate the balloon. And you see, in history there are maybe two kinds of humor. The dark side of humor is when you make fun of the weak. That you tell, and this is also very common, that you tell jokes about the weakest members of society. And that's not dangerous. That's the easy stuff. Mm-hmm. And it only contributes to greater inequality in society. Humor is at its best also in terms of contribution to society when you make fun of the people at the top. So like you go back to the Middle Ages, I'm a medievalist, so this is why I always go back to the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. The best medieval humor is jokes about priests and church people. There is nothing like, you want good medieval jokes, it's all the jokes about the priests and the Pope, and because they are the big shots. Yeah. And from this perspective, it's a very important force for equality, for bringing the mighty a little bit down to the level of everybody else.
And what was the purpose of court jesters and people who serve those functions in society?
Also, in a way, a court jester is somebody who, under the protection of humor and comedy, is allowed to say things that if anybody else said them, they will just chop off his head. So it's another mechanism to, again, a little to level the playing field. That you will be able to tell the big emperor something that the big emperor needs to hear, but everybody is afraid of saying. So you have the court gesture. Again, an example from the Middle Ages, when in one of the many battles between the French and the English in the 100 Years' War, I think it was Sluis, the English, it was a naval battle between navies, and the English Navy won a great victory, lots of French ships drowned with all the people. So everybody was so afraid to tell the French king that they lost. So they gave the task to the court jester, who told the king that, wonderful, your troops have just learned to speak the language of the fish. And the king got the message.
And can you talk a little bit about your interest in meditation and how it affects your life and also allows you to do this work that you do? I was reading that you seem to have a very challenging 2-hour-a-day meditation schedule. Is that what you're doing, like an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening? And can you talk about how you came to that and how it affects your life and your work?
So first, it's not challenging. I mean, I find it relaxing. Yeah. It's not kind of, when I meditate, there is no goal. It's just observing what's happening right now. So in this sense, it's the most relaxing part of the day, or at least most of the time. I came to it when I was doing my PhD in history, and a friend recommended that. I was also very much concerned about the big questions of life. Who am I? What's the deal here? What's the meaning of life? And I read so many philosophy books and couldn't find any good answers. And he told me, you will never find the answers just in reading books. And if there were answers in books, you would already know them. You've read so much. So try something else. And it didn't sound very convincing to me, But I was kind of desperate, and I said, okay, why not? And I went to this meditation retreat, Vipassana meditation, and the very first night I was really struck by, I know it was a very, very simple instruction on the face of it. The instruction was just, sit down, close your eyes, focus your entire attention on your breath. Just feel the breath coming into your nostrils and the breath going out. That's it. This is what we need to do for an hour now. And it's not even a breathing exercise. It's not like you try to control the breath and you can fail.
Yeah.
It's not like somebody told you, you must breathe through the right nostril. If you breathe through the left nostril, you're a failure in meditation. No, it was just note, is it now coming in or is it now going out? And I was absolutely struck by the fact that I couldn't do it for more than 10 seconds before my mind would just wander off to some memory, some fantasy, some worry, and for 5 minutes I would roll in that before remembering, I need to observe my breath. And within a very short time, I understood something that I didn't understand after years in university and reading books, which is that I have almost no control over my mind, and I know very, very little about what's actually happening within me, within my mind. And this was a very shocking and humbling experience, but it kind of opened the way to a completely new kind of investigation and practice, which is not based on reading and writing and things like that, but really on just, you just directly observe what is happening. The key idea is, it goes back to what we discussed earlier of stories and fictions, that the mind is like a factory which constantly manufactures stories. And these stories come between me and the world. Most of what I see in life, when I look at US politics, when I look at the global economy, when I look at my own body, most of what I see is the stories generated by my own mind. They are just overpowering. And the key instruction of this kind of meditation, there are many kinds of meditation, but this kind of Vipassana, the key instruction is let go of all these stories, just try to observe what is actually happening right now. If you can't observe the breath coming in and out of your nostrils because your mind is too busy, involved in some story, how do you expect to understand US politics without your own stories getting in the way? And this what connects me back to my job as a historian. When I meditate, I don't have any historical insights. I don't think, at least hopefully, I don't think about the Roman Empire or whatever. But it trains the mind to develop this ability to put aside the stories that I generate and thereby have a clearer vision of whatever it is I'm investigating.
And is there a spiritual aspect to it for you? I know sometimes when I write or I deal with creative people, we talk a lot about, sometimes the writing just appears or an idea comes to you, or for Bob Dylan, it's almost like the songs were written somewhere else and he's just writing them down. And I was talking to a friend yesterday about, universal creativity, or the feeling that you're tapping into, the universal creativity in some way. Do you have any beliefs in those areas, or has your meditation made you believe in any type of, interconnectivity or magic or anything like that?
No, I'm not that kind of guy, I think. I do see it as a spiritual practice, but my definition of spirituality is when you have a big question and you are willing to follow it wherever it takes you, no matter how painful or difficult or what you need to give up along the way. This is, for me, the spiritual quest. You can ask a question like, who am I? Or again, what is good? Or what is the meaning of life? Or whatever. It can be many, many things. And you're willing, religion, which I think is, in a way, the opposite of spirituality. Religion is when you ask a question, somebody gives you an answer, and says, you have to believe that answer. No more questioning. This is religion. Spirituality is when you are willing to follow that question wherever it takes you. And very often it takes you to question many things that you took for granted in life. And the origin of the term spirituality, again, a little history kind of insight. Where does it come? Why spirituality? It actually comes from dualistic religions about 2,000 years ago, that they told people a story that the entire world you see around you is the material world. But you don't belong to this material world. There is another world. It's called a dualistic religion because it believes in the separation of reality into two different realms, like matter and spirit. So the story goes that you actually are, you belong to the world of the spirits, and you somehow fell into this material world around you. And your mission in life, the spiritual quest, is to get liberated from this material realm and get back to the spiritual realm. And the quest involves questioning the reality. This is not everything you take for granted. It's not real. You need to question it and go beyond it in order to get back to your real place, the world of the spirits. And so spiritual quest in this sense is a kind of journey where you are willing to question the most basic assumptions of the world around you. Now, in the original dualistic sense, it's to question the world of matter, the body, the stones, the houses around you. But in a more metaphorical or broader sense, is the willingness to question the major beliefs of the day. It could be capitalism, it could be religion. Very often, again, this is the clash between religion and spirituality, that religion tells you you must believe, and the spiritual quest tells you no, if you really want to know the truth, you have to liberate yourself from these religious preconceptions and biases too.
Yeah, and so much of our conflict comes from, people or nations, going to war with each other over these ideas, protecting their boundaries, or trying to keep their population as one religion. And so, sadly, the result is often the opposite of why we need religion.
Yes, again, religion can be a force for both good and evil. Historically speaking, we know a lot of examples from both sides of both good and bad things. But in essence, as a historian, the key thing is to understand religion is not created in heaven and remains as some kind of eternal truth. Religion is created by human beings on earth. It changes all the time. And it's up to humans what to do with it. You now have all these arguments about Islam, whether Islam is a religion of war or peace. And the truth is that Islam is whatever Muslims make of it. If you have Muslims that make it a religion of war, it would be a religion of war. If you have Muslims who make it a religion of peace, it will be a religion of peace. It has no unchanging essence that this is true Islam. If you go back again to the Middle Ages, so you see that back then, the world of Islam was much more tolerant than Christianity. people were fleeing. Christian Europe was the most intolerant area in the entire world. You had religious persecutions and religious refugees fleeing Western Europe to find a safe and tolerant haven in the Muslim Middle East. Like my husband, he comes from a family of Egyptian Jews. His parents came from Cairo. But their family name is Rodriguez. Now, Rodriguez is not a very Egyptian name, right? Yeah. It's a Spanish name. Actually, his ancestors, they lived in Spain, and in 1492, they were expelled from Spain under the Catholic kings, in one of the starkest examples of religious intolerance in that period, and they fled and found a tolerant safe haven in Egypt. So today it's the reverse. Today you have millions of people fleeing religious wars and persecutions in the Middle East trying to make their way to Europe. But it's not something essential about the nature of Christianity and the nature of Islam. It's what people make of these religions, and they change a lot over time.
Yeah, I mean, I relate to it in the sense that when I was a kid, my family's Jewish, but for whatever reason, they didn't practice, and they had no interest in it whatsoever. And my parents, I used to say the only religion they taught me was nobody said life was fair. And that was the mantra in the house. So there really was an absence of it that I was left to have to try to fill. And I, I'm not sure if I've ever fully filled it, but I was more attracted to Buddhist ideas. And the only idea that really ever made any sense to me is just, the Dalai Lama saying, my religion is kindness. And for me, the simplicity of that is the only thing I can follow. When Buddhism gets into, past lives and reincarnation, my brain just kind of melts. But, have trouble getting there with it. Not that I wouldn't want to, but I have a hard time, believing in those ideas, although I'm not close to those ideas or any ideas really, because I do find that the world is so, it's such a miracle that anything's possible. I have a friend, Pete Holmes, who's a great comedian, and he's very religious, and he says, a lot of people say, how could you believe in heaven? How could you believe heaven exists? And he always says, well, why does this exist? We're on a rock flying around the sun at thousands of miles an hour. It's like, isn't it weird that this is here? And I've always believed that almost anything seems possible as we learn more about science. And you also write about the future and what may happen as a result of the advance of technology. Where does your mind go when you think about what is possible with all we are learning about the rules of the universe?
Well, possible, almost everything is possible. It's a question not just of, enumerating possibilities, but finding evidence. When you look at the past, then the key is to find actual evidence for your stories or your models. Just saying it's possible, yes, everything is possible. It is possible that we are all in a simulation inside a computer operated by a teenage nerd on the planet Zircon. It is possible. But okay, what do you do with that? So when I looked at the future, I think that we are very, very close to the end of the story that the graphic novel depicts. It's the beginning of that story. 70,000 years ago, humans were just another insignificant animal minding its own business in a corner of Africa. We didn't have a big impact on the world. We had some impact, like gorillas, like woodpeckers, like jellyfish. Okay, you had sapiens doing a few things. Then you had this big explosion of humans learning how to cooperate in larger and larger numbers thanks to stories and fiction, and taking over the world and creating more and more sophisticated tools and technology. And now we are almost at the end of that particular story, because we are on the verge of creating technology to change the basic rules of the game of life. For not just for 70,000 years, but for 4 billion years, since the very beginning of life on Earth, all life forms were subject to two sets of rules, two sets of laws. You had the laws of natural selection, about how evolution functions, and you had the laws of organic chemistry, because all life was organic. Whether you're an amoeba, or a Tyrannosaurus rex, or a potato, or a Homo sapiens, you are made of organic stuff, and you evolve by natural selection. And we are almost at the end of this, because now with the rise of artificial intelligence and bioengineering, we are about to break both sets of rules. Bioengineering means that instead of natural selection, increasingly it will be intelligent design, not of some god, but of our intelligent design, which will determine the future course of evolution. And the rise of artificial intelligence implies that we might be on the verge of creating the first inorganic life forms. After 4 billion years of organic life, that's a complete game changer. And from this perspective, my guess is that in 200 years, and that's a conservative estimate, I would say, in 200 years, planet Earth will be dominated by entities which are far more different from us than we are different from Neanderthals or from chimpanzees.
Yeah.
The characters in the graphic novel, they travel in time from here to the Stone Age, and you meet people who are just like you.
Yeah,
Not in their technology, but their bodies and minds are the same. But you travel 200 years to the future, and our imagination cannot grasp it, because even our imagination is the product of organic chemistry, which is about to reach the end of its dominion.
So I should freeze my brain so that they can bring back my consciousness? Is that what you're trying to say? That I should just
why would they bother?
Exactly. I know. It does feel like. Do you ever feel like it's like a weird moment in time that we live in, because we're right on the cusp of when they're going to figure out so much. And so, I always think, yes, there'll be a future where maybe half my body will be bionic, or my consciousness will somehow be, put into a computer, and I could live on as half of a robot, half computer. And I think different people have different instincts about how they feel about that. I'm ready to check out. I don't need to be a part of the next
don't worry, it won't be us.
It won't be us.
It won't be us. We are, whether you like it or not, we are just missing the train.
I know, that's what I feel like.
A baby born today, he or she will have to deal with the full force of these revolutions. We are probably going to check out before the really big revolution hits.
Yeah, I'm happy about that, personally.
Unless you believe in reincarnation.
Well, exactly. Well, maybe I'll be so happy to check out, and then suddenly, like, I'm back. All right, I'm half a robot now. It all worked out for me. Ted, were we going to take some questions from?
Yes, I have some questions. If you guys are ready.
Sure.
Yeah.
Several questions about the pandemic. The first one is, could you please put the coronavirus pandemic in a historical context, given humankind ongoing destruction of the Earth's ability to sustain human life?
Well, as pandemics go in history, this is a relatively mild one. It's not the Black Death. It's not the terrible epidemics that destroyed 90% of the population of America after the Europeans conquered it. Mortality rates are very, very low compared to these previous catastrophes. Also, in this pandemic, we have the scientific knowledge to control it, which is really almost the first time in history. During the Black Death, which killed up to half the population of Europe and Asia, nobody understood what was happening. Now, it took just 2 weeks to identify the virus, the coronavirus, and sequence its genome. We have all the scientific knowledge we need to overcome this, but we don't always have the political wisdom to do it. I think the coronavirus epidemic is a mixture of an amazing scientific success with terrible political incompetence. First of all, on a global level, that even almost a year after the beginning of the pandemic, there is no global leadership, there is no global plan of action of how to control and stop not just the epidemic, but also the economic crisis. And also on the level of different countries, you see that some countries have done very well, whether it's New Zealand or Taiwan. Some countries like the US and like Brazil have done disastrously. To put it in context of the current trajectory of humanity, the bad news is that, again, this is a relatively small threat to humanity. The ecological crisis is much bigger. The rise of artificial intelligence is much bigger. If we cannot unite in the face of COVID-19, what are the chances we will be able to unite in the face of the much more difficult challenges of artificial intelligence or ecological collapse? That's the big worry, and that is where I would put the COVID-19 pandemic in larger context.
There's a follow-up question to that. Historically speaking, are there any positive outcomes post-pandemic? What are your thoughts on possible positive impact from the COVID-19 epidemic?
At least in recent generations, quite often pandemics lead to a jump in scientific knowledge and in investment in public health. You saw it with the big cholera epidemics of the 19th century and early 20th century, which led to the establishment of public water systems and sewage systems and public hygiene, which saved hundreds of millions of lives in subsequent decades. So hopefully we would see the same thing happening with COVID, that humanity got this huge shock, and especially the economic system got this huge shock. Hopefully it will prompt a lot more investments in not just fighting epidemics, but building a better healthcare system for the entire world, because we now realize that even a healthcare disaster on the other side of the world could very quickly lead to medical and economic disaster at home. Whether this will actually happen, I don't know. It's not a prophecy. But that's my main hope. There is a chance, it's just a chance, it's not a prophecy. There is a chance that COVID is actually the last big pandemic. Again, it's not that there won't be any more new viruses or pathogens, but that because of the current shock, new systems of early warning and treatment will be put in place, so humanity will not be caught off guard again. We can't stop the evolution of new viruses and bacteria and so forth, but we now have so much scientific and technological knowledge that if we combine it with the right political wisdom, this could be the last big pandemic.
I guess what all this relates to is if we feel like corporations and all this new technology will ultimately be for good, or will some of our worst instincts lead us to disaster? So for instance, you have corporations in the United States and they align themselves with the evangelical community, and you wouldn't assume that corporations are religious, but as a strategy, they found a way to align with certain religions to get voters to vote in people who will support their interests. And so ultimately, does it lead to we got a vaccine, and maybe the people who believe in corporations and their innate goodness are proven correct, or are we on the road to some other disaster, which is, like what we're seeing with social media, how it's changing how people feel about things. We don't know, I guess.
Yeah, it can go both ways. And I would just again emphasize there is nothing wrong with aligning yourself with churches or religious movements. It depends on the values and practice of these movements.
Yeah.
I don't know, you see Pope Francis, for example, talking about the dangers of climate change and talking about the dangers of ecological collapse. And I would be all in favor of cooperating with the Catholic Church on that particular front. Yeah. On other things, I have issues with the Church. But again, the key thing in history is human cooperation. And you can't always choose your allies. And it's dangerous to kind of rule out in advance certain people. It has to be practical. If you can unite with people to advance a good cause, then do it.
Do you find that as someone who's become very famous for your books, there's always usually just a few historians that the world gets to know very well. Are you also having people challenge your ideas, or are you in the center of, hotly contested debates about everything that you're saying? What is the world of competitive historianism like right now for you?
Well, it's not very competitive because you don't have a lot of other historians out there.
Yes.
It's not Wall Street, And it is challenging because 10 years ago I was an anonymous professor for medieval military history, and now I'm talking about COVID and about artificial intelligence and whatever. But I think historians have a lot to contribute to humanity. We can't predict the future. That's absolutely should be clear. We have no ability to predict the future. Really, the best thing about history is that it opens new possibilities, not narrows them. Predicting the future is you have a couple of possibilities and you try to focus on just one, which you think will happen. History does the opposite thing. It shows you more possibilities which you haven't thought about before. Usually people have this kind of linear thinking. We think about the last 10 or 20 years and we extrapolate to the future. With history, you can look back thousands of years and you realize that the last 10 or 20 years were unique. They are always unique. And history never moves in a straight line. So it's always a mistake to assume that we'll just see more of the same. Mm-hmm. Again, this is not the ability to foretell what will actually happen, but it broadens the mind to include more possibilities. And this is what I see as my job as a historian, to provide a kind of map. And I don't think that history is just the past. I think history is the study of change, not the study of the past. And change also includes the future. So it's mapping all the roads we have traveled in the past, but also the different roads that we might travel in the future.
And does doing this work make you optimistic as a person? Are you, like, for all you study, does it make you like people? What is your feeling as a human being about us as human beings?
You see the extremes, which you don't normally see in your everyday life. You see the extremes of the worst crimes and the worst stupidity that humans are capable of, even if it happened generations or thousands of years ago. But you also see amazing acts of charity and wisdom, which again, you don't encounter in daily life. So instead of making me more optimistic or pessimistic, it kind of broadens the spectrum. Mm-hmm. I can be far more pessimistic because I remember some of the really terrible things that humans can do. But also there is more space for optimism, because you see that it not always ends badly. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are now, for instance, living still in the most peaceful era in human history. So I don't think in a fixed, law of the conservation of violence. There is always the same level of violence in the world, and if you have a couple of years of peace, you will pay for it by a big explosion of war after that. No, I don't think there is such a law. You see that throughout history, some places are very violent, some places are very peaceful. It doesn't necessarily always even out, which means that if we act wisely, we can make the world a more peaceful place.
I have a couple more questions. What do you envision as the ultimate education system or philosophy of the future? How do you evaluate self-directed education based on, say, play, intrinsic motivation, pursuing passions, social and emotional intelligence, and apprenticeships, which had been a feature of hunter-gatherer societies versus the current institutionalized compulsory education systems that most prevalent modern industrialized societies have?
Well, it's a big question, and I'm not an expert on education. I would say that when it comes to life skills, which for most people I think are much more important than having a PhD or a college degree, this is the kind of thing that you learn best by living and by apprenticeships and by relationships. You don't need to go to college to learn empathy or to learn curiosity. So this is something that is and should be accessible for all people. When you talk about a specific subject, like history or like biology or economics or whatever, then we have no choice but to rely to some extent on institutions, because nobody can research everything by himself or herself. It's just impractical. I, as a historian, when I write, say, the graphic novel, I rely on the findings of so many other people. I rely on archaeologists. I never conducted an archaeological expedition in my life. I rely on geneticists. I don't know how to extract DNA and how to sequence DNA, and so forth. So if I told myself I have to research everything by myself, it would never work. Now the question is, so who do you trust? And if I know somebody personally, I can trust them. But again, you can't know everybody personally. So the real trust that we need in those fields are in institutions, universities, archives, journals. If trust in institutions break down, then science collapses completely. To tell people, go and do your own research, it's impossible. I mean, how can one person just by oneself go and excavate all the archaeological sites in the world? You need to believe somebody. So for instance, I have faith because I know the mechanism behind it. I have faith in scientific journals that what is being published there, it's not a gospel truth, could be mistakes, but there are also self-correcting mechanisms. So I trust these kinds of institutions, and so far I don't see something that can replace them.
And our final question, the questioner assumes you've read Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind. Having read that, has it altered your overall view of humanity? In your mind, are humans born with a stronger propensity for kindness or cruelty? And jokingly adds, what do you think of the idea that we really are Homo puppies?
I've read the book. It's a very good book, highly recommended. I find many of the arguments convincing. But again, generally, humans are both. I would avoid the extreme of pessimism and optimism about human nature. We have examples of both. And I think that somewhere there he has this famous parable that somebody explains to a young person that inside you, you have two wolves, one good and one evil fighting against each other. And the person asks, so who wins? And they tell him, the one you feed. So yes, we have both good and very bad tendencies within ourselves, as most animals have. And we have some measure of control which tendencies we feed. You know, you look at social media, so you can sit for an hour every day and feed your fear and your hatred and your anger, and they will become bigger. Or you can sit for 1 hour every day and, I don't know, meditate and feed your kindness. To that extent, it's up to you who wins.
Well, with that, that brings us to an end of a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Judd, for joining us again and chatting with Yuval. Again, Yuval's new book is Sapiens, A Graphic History, The Birth of Humankind, Volume 1. It is available wherever books are sold.